And this is number one, time after time after time. And if you know me long enough, you can complete this sentence. God is always faithful. And we've seen that throughout the entirety of Esther. That some people could say that the events that happened in Esther were all happenstance after happenstance after happenstance, or coinky-dink after coinky-dink after coinky-dink. But everything had to fall into place for exactly what God wanted to happen, and that is not a coincidence. Because many times when we think about how God works and how God plans, we don't see how he's working. Now, for some of you, you might be like myself, and you want to be like, I want to know how things are going to happen, what time they're going to happen, and who's going to do it. Anybody else? Anybody else a planner? And then when it falls apart, you go, but that's not what we've seen in Esther. And then in Esther chapter 4, we saw the most famous verse out of all of Esther. Maybe you're put here for such time as this, but we looked at what came after that when Mordecai says to Esther, or maybe God would find another way. And so the past 2 weeks, we saw how Haman got his due in the end, that what he wanted to do to Mordecai with a little bit of shish kebab, Haman ended up being shish kebab, and his whole family. But if your Bibles, we're going to be in Esther chapter 9, starting in verse 20. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would be to commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why the celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. Let's pause right here. So Mordecai wants the Jews to set up a what? A celebration of what God has done for them. Because when God does something great, his people are to celebrate it. You know, sometimes we could just go through life willy-nilly. But then just in our everyday lives, what are things that we celebrate? Birthdays, anniversaries. What else? Easter, Christmas. Now, for us to celebrate things like that, what had to happen beforehand? Something good happened. Think about even outside of personal things. On July 4th, we celebrate America's what? Independence Day. On D-Day, we celebrate what? What was able to be accomplished when a bunch of people came together, when good went against evil. But for all these things, we look back and we celebrate and we remember. Now, why do we like to remember these things? Because they are good things. But so often what happens for average everyday people, including myself, is we celebrate things in our personal lives, but we so often forget to celebrate when God does something good. It goes back to that whole idea. Many times we make the joke that sometimes people go to church 2 times a year, on Christmas and Easter. Why? Because sometimes it's really easy to get lackadaisical in the way that we go about our faith. Because majority of our lives, if we were to admit it, and if we're to be completely do everything that we wanted just for ourselves, Humans are by and large selfish people. We want to do what makes us happy, what makes us, well, for me, it's what tastes good. I'll be honest, I'm a foodie. Smoking meat and, now I got a little flat top thingy, so now I'm experimenting with those kind of things. And so, most of the time I'll ask Alex, hey, what do you want to try? And she'll be like, well, what do you want to try? I'm like, okay, she just gave open option for me to make whatever I want, as long as it's nothing that she really doesn't like. But sometimes I can sneak it in there. But we're supposed to celebrate things. And here's the irony here. This festival that the Jews celebrate to this day of what God did in their redemption is called Purim. And what did it just say? That it is named after what was done to decide everything, the casting of lots. So, if you would, turn back with me to chapter 3, verse 7. Chapter 3, verse 7. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence, and the lots were called Purim. And you can turn back over to chapter 9. But what the enemy meant for evil against the Jewish people took that and turned it into a celebration. Because what was supposed to have sealed their fate did what? Nothing. But instead, the Jewish people were redeemed, they were saved because God moved on their behalf. Second part of verse 26. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. I'll pause right there. One thing that's interesting is if you look at what's going on in the world today, we know that the Jewish people of Israel are at war and being attacked. If you saw what happened just 2 days ago, Israel was attacked again, and the only people that were killed were civilian children. One of the things that stands out about the festival of Purim is it's not only a celebration, but it's also a reminder to the people of Israel that if they do not stand up to defend themselves, people will come against them with evil intent. If you've ever watched politics here recently in this past week, you know that the current Prime Minister of Israel addressed a joint session of Congress this past week. It was on Wednesday, I think, Wednesday or Thursday. And one of the first things that he said, because I was hanging out in the truck with Clara while Alex was in for testing, so she's watching her and playing her little game, and I'm listening to a prime minister address the United States. That tells you where my mind was at. And one of the things that he's opened with is the nation of Israel always has the right to defend itself. And I said normally I try not to go too political. But as an American citizen, it was an embarrassment to me that when he landed, he did not get the typical dignitary welcome by any United States officials when he landed. Nobody was there. Normally it's the president, the vice president, UN ambassador, secretary of state. Nobody was there. And I'm thinking, the United States must stand with its friend Israel. Because one of the things that we see in biblical history is that when you do not stand with Israel, your nation is doomed. Because still to this day, the people of Israel are God's chosen people. Because even when Paul puts it in the New Testament, that us who are non-Jews, who are Gentiles, we are adopted into spiritual Israel. But God's favor on his people of literal Jewish birth, Israel, has never changed. And even to this day, one of the things when Bibi Netanyahu addresses people about what's going on in Israel, Purim and the reminders of it are still brought up to this day. When the Holocaust happened in World War II, this was still brought up to that day then. Why? Because ever since then, the people of Israel know that God will be with them. And they celebrate that. They stand with that. Because when God does something great, it should be remembered. But at the same time, when we celebrate things, it also stands as a reminder of what could have happened. Verse 29, the Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was all written down in the records. So not only was Mordecai, who was, as it has been said, a Jew, establishing it to the people saying, hey, we need to do this. But at this point, which name is the author of Esther choosing to use for Esther? Her Jewish name or her Persian name? Her Persian name. Because the authority rested in the queen was rested in that. You know, I've heard it told before that when you look at the book of Esther, you see Esther's journey from Hadassah to Esther, to how she moved from this young girl who was scared to death to now the most powerful woman in the known world as the Persian queen. But there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things that we focus on sometimes, and I'll say this about all of the Bible, is that we focus on the people who do the acting instead of the God who does the moving. And I know sometimes I just think how much God does behind the scenes without us knowing, how much he moves, the things that he controls. I was thinking this week, and this is also where my mind is, you know, it's pretty amazing how babies get here. For everything that has to happen in the fetal development from conception to born baby. You know, somebody says, how do you know there's a God? That doesn't just happen on its own. I mean, I'm seeing a little baby right there, a baby back there, and they're just so cute. But they go from like little cells beginning to expand and develop, and it's amazing how God works. And for the majority of it, and here's what I've had to come to rest with after all my years on this earth, is we're never fully gonna get it. It doesn't matter how much you've studied the Bible. It doesn't matter how much formal theological education you have. It has to come down to God just moves and we're not going to get it. You know, I've heard from older saints from all these years that some of them have lists that they are going to ask God when they get to heaven. And some of you in here are some of those people who've told me that you have lists and some of the things on your list. But it's amazing how God works sometimes. It's amazing how God worked through Esther. That the largest up to this point in biblical history genocide that had ever been established that was going to happen was stopped by God and God alone through his people and by their willingness to do what he had called them to do. And I love chapter 10. It's the short little record. King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements in the full account of the greatness of who? Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became the prime minister with authority next to that of the king Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews who held him in high esteem because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak for the welfare of all their descendants. The verse that comes to mind as we've been going through Esther, in my mind, is this: what the enemy meant for evil, God meant for good. How else can Mordecai, the one person working in the palace that would not bow to Haman, the one who started this whole thing, that he was the reason that an entire genocide was about to happen against the Jewish people, because Mordecai would bow to God and God alone. At the last part of Esther is now the prime minister of all the Persian Empire. It doesn't just happen. And to think about it this way, that as much as we think about Esther's journey through the book of Esther, it is as much Mordecai's journey through the book of Esther. Mordecai just started out as the guy who was worried about his cousin who had been taken into the palace and wanted to know what was going on. So he got a job at the palace just to be the guy at the gate who everybody waved to as he went through. Haman came into the picture. Haman wanted everybody to bow to him now that he was second in command and essentially worship him. But Mordecai's decision not to became a stick in Haman's craw, and he would not get over it. So instead, he's like, I'm just going to kill all the Jews. But what else did we say? Haman in Esther is known as Haman the Agite, which we dug a little bit, and it wasn't specifically, there were no technical Agites. There were Amalekites, and Agag was the king, and because Saul did not do what he was supposed to do, this happened to the Jews at this point. One man's sin brought a people's destruction. But it's the same way for all of us if we think back even to Adam, because Adam and Eve's sin brought sin into the world, and so now all of us have to deal with sin. Thanks, Uncle Adam. Or I guess it would be Granddad Adam. Great. There's some people who love biblical history that much that have figured that out. I'll leave that to them. But I want to get back to this whole idea of remembering when God has done something great. If you have your Bibles, if you would, turn back to the book of Joshua, chapter 4. As you turn there, a little bit of context. We're at the beginning of the book of Joshua. At this point, the very last part of Deuteronomy, Moses has just died, handed over command to Joshua The 12 spies have just gone out and come back. 10 of them say, we are in trouble if we try to do this. 2 of them said, God is faithful. And so the people come up to the Jordan River. The Jordan River parts before them. This leads us in Joshua chapter 4. When all the people had crossed the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, now choose 12 men, one from each tribe. Tell them, take 12 stones from the very place where the priests are standing in the middle of the Jordan. Carry them out and pile them up at the place where you will camp tonight. So Joshua called the 12 men he had chosen, one from each of the tribes of Israel. He told them, go into the middle of the Jordan in front of the ark of the Lord your God. Each of you must pick up one stone and carry it out on your shoulder. 12 stones in all, each for the 12 tribes of Israel. We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them, they remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand forever as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. Mordecai calling for a festival or a memorial celebration is nothing new. For the Jewish people, every time God did something great, they built an altar. First thing, when Noah and his family came out of the ark, guess what they built? An altar. When God proved himself to Abraham after Abraham doubted, what did Abraham build? An altar. A couple of things when God does something great that we can see. First thing, when God does something great, the people involved should first and foremost worship him for what he just did. Second thing, when God does something great, the people of God should never fail to remember his goodness and his faithfulness to them. Sometimes it is a physical thing that people build to remember. Other times it's just writing it down and celebrating it. 2 weeks ago, we remembered God's faithfulness to this church and celebrating 130 years of ministry in Canadian. It takes a lot to get that far. Last I saw, and this could have changed, that the average church in the United States nowadays doesn't make it past 30 to 50 years. But 130 years later, and we're still standing. Through tornadoes, through wildfires, through crazy things that have just happened in the life of the church is still here because of God's faithfulness. If you would take a look at any church, for all the good that goes on, at some point there was some bad. And I love the saying, it's out of a movie. The church is not perfect because people are not perfect. People can damage a church's reputation, but people can never damage God's reputation. Because forever and ever, God stands above it all. Because he is faithful, because he redeems, because he will do the impossible. In Ephesians, there's this passage for a couple of years ago. I put it on every single thing that I sent out from the church. Now to him who is able to do incredibly more than we could ask or imagine, to him be the glory and honor forever. Now, why would I put that on there? Because God is always able to do more than we can think or imagine. The story of Esther is God doing way more than Mordecai could have ever thought or imagined. You know, we see as soon as he finds out this order from Haman, he starts praying. He puts on sackcloth. He puts on ashes. Because the first thing that he does when things are bad is he goes to God in prayer saying, God, I know that you are able and that you are faithful. And that inspired the people around him to do the same thing, that they would pray to God and say, God, we know you are able. We know that you are faithful. We need you to deliver us. And I'll bunny trail this. But it's one thing to think that, but it's another thing to get down on your knees and pray for that. It's not that if we don't pray, God won't move. He can still move. But sometimes that we actually have to get down on our knees and humble ourselves before him to show him we know exactly who we are in position to him. Which for most of us would be something different. Because normally for the majority of us, by the time that we get to that place of getting down on our knees and praying, things have gotten to the worst that we could ever think. But God is the same God up here all along. It's just us finally getting in our position where we need to be. It's like when Mordecai told Esther, maybe God has put you in this place for such a time as this. But you have to be willing to do it, because at this point, she is still scared. But Mordecai says, step into what God has for you. And I asked that question of all of us weeks ago and even again today. Will we step into what God has for us? Will we trust him that if we take that step of faith, that he will honor that? Because sometimes when it comes to us taking steps of faith, it is exactly that. It's us actually taking that first step of faith. Because sometimes the things that God calls us to in our mind are scary. Even this idea of honoring God in everything, in our time, in our finances, and going out and sharing Jesus with people, it can be scary. Going and asking somebody, hey, can I tell you about Jesus? If we were to ask that to somebody in this room, there are still some people who are so extremely introverted that they don't even want to talk to people they haven't talked to before. But if I said, hey, after this, I want every single person here to go down to the grocery store and go say to one person, can I tell you about Jesus? I could probably count on one hand the people who wouldn't say that Matt is crazy. Because you'd be like, well, I actually know those people. It's like I've had conversations with people in here. We've gone on mission trips, and this conversation happens. It's easier to talk about Jesus with people you don't know than people you do know. Because sometimes if you talk about Jesus with people you do know, that might compromise your relationship, because they might be like, oh, you actually want to talk to me about that? Or this one, which always makes people mad. You want me to trust God with my finances? I make the joke a lot, I think some people would rather ask me, or me ask them to go share Jesus with someone than me tell them, are you where you need to be with your finances in relationship to God? But one of the big things as we start to wind down this morning that the book of Esther is all about is it's everybody going all in for God. It's about people going all in, not knowing what would happen. It's about people literally risking their lives, wanting things and needing things and praying about things, that God would go before them. Because one of the last things that Esther did before she went before the king is she prayed and she fasted. Because if she wouldn't have had the king's favor the first time that she went before him, what would have happened? She would have died. And so as we conclude this morning, last couple thoughts. God is not a God of coincidence. God is a God of purposeful intention. 2, God always knows what is going on even when we don't. 3, God is always in control, even when we don't see it. 4, God is always faithful to his people when they do what he has called them to do. 5, fifth and final. God was and God always will be a God of redemption when people cry out to him. He will always redeem. And all of those other things build up to that. God is able, he is willing, and he is faithful to redeem people when they cry out to him. What's so special about Jesus? The fullness of God's redemption rests in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus and him alone is able to forgive sin. He is able to redeem. He is able to restore. He is able to fix. Because we can't do it on our own. Only Jesus can. Because God is always faithful. It's like Paul says in Romans, all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Just as the people of Israel cried out to be saved, you and I can do the same thing. Might not necessarily be a physical salvation, but it can be a spiritual one. Because Jesus can redeem that which is broken inside of us. Let's pray.